For the first time in ages, I didn't know what to do next. My mind was a swirl of confusion and uncertainty, and the house felt like a quiet prison. Ethan and I had been walking around, circling each other with barely a word spoken for days. Something had shifted between us, though I wasn't sure exactly when it happened. We were trying to figure out what was wrong, but neither of us had the words. It had been a spontaneous decision to go for a drive. Ethan had mentioned wanting to clear his head, and I'd suggested we take a road trip. Maybe the open road would offer us some space, a chance to breathe and hopeful talk. The car ride stretched ahead, and silence sat between us like a heavy, unwelcome guest. The road wound on, disappearing into the horizon where the late afternoon sun hung like a golden orb. The air was fresh, cool enough to leave the windows down, and the scent of wildflowers mixed with the earthiness of the soil beneath. It was a perfect kind of day, the kind that could almost make you forget the confusion lurking in your mind. Ethan sat next to me in the passenger seat, his arm resting on the open window, his face tilted toward the wind. There was a calmness to him, or so it seemed. I could tell, though, that something was simmering beneath that outward peace. He hadn't said much since we left, and I hadn't pressed him. The space was suffocating, but I didn't know how to fill it. It was one of those road trips born from nothing more than awkward silences in the house of no real plans or destinations, just a shared need to escape. I glanced over at him as the miles passed. His face remained unreadable, his expression a mask. What was he thinking? What was going on inside his head? I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to break the silence. "Beautiful, isn't it?" I said, gesturing to the fields of wildflowers on both sides of the road. The colors danced in the warm light of the setting sun, splashes of purple, yellow, and red against the deep green. Ethan nodded, his lips curling slightly into a small smile. "Yeah, it really is," he said softly, his voice barely rising above the hum of the engine. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me wonder what was going on behind that smile. We drove for a little longer before I pulled the car over onto a gravel path that led to a small clearing. It was a spot I'd found years ago, a place I used to come when I needed to think. I figured maybe it would help us clear our minds. Ethan stepped out of the car and wandered over to the edge of the clearing, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets. I followed, giving him space but staying close enough to make sure he knew I was there. I stood a few feet away, the wind tousling my hair, the silence between us stretching. We both stood there, looking out over the rolling hills that stretched endlessly beneath the soft glow of the fading sunlight. It was so quiet, and yet there was a tension in the air, a weight neither of us could shake off. Neither of us spoke for a long time. It wasn't awkward exactly, but it felt like something was hanging in the air that we both knew needed to be addressed. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice a whisper, barely louder than the rustle of the grass beneath our feet. "Thanks for bringing me here," he said. I smiled faintly, leaning back against the car. "I figured you could use a change of scenery," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. He didn't answer at first. His gaze remained on the horizon, distant, lost in thought. After a moment, he finally turned to me. His eyes met mine, and there was something raw in his gaze, vulnerable, unguarded. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he said, his voice hesitant. "About what?" I asked casually, though my heart had begun to race. Whatever it was, I had a feeling it was something I didn't want to hear. "About us," he said quietly, his hands trembling as they slipped out of his pockets. The words caught me off guard. My stomach twisted, and I found myself holding my breath, unsure of what to expect. "Us?" I echoed, the word feeling foreign on my tongue. "What about us?" Ethan hesitated, his eyes flickering away from mine for just a moment. "I don't know how to say this," he admitted, his voice cracking. "Just say it," I urged gently. "Whatever it is, you can tell me." His face was twisted in anguish, as though he was battling something deep inside himself. He closed his eyes, his body rigid, like he was trying to hold back an ocean of emotion. And then, as though it was the hardest thing he'd ever said, he finally spoke. "I love you," he whispered, not just as my father. "I love you more than that." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My heart seemed to stop. and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I stood there, frozen, my mind scrambling to understand what he was saying, what he meant. Ethan, my voice broke, and I could barely bring myself to speak. I don't know what to say. He took a step back, his face pale, his hands trembling. I know it's wrong, he said quickly. I've tried to fight it for so long. I didn't want to feel this way, but I can't stop. I don't know what to do anymore. The words were coming fast, tumbling out like he was afraid if he didn't say them now, he'd never get the chance. And the more he spoke, the more it hit me this. Wasn't just confusion. It wasn't just a phase. It was something deeper, something unspoken that had been building for months, maybe longer. I stepped toward him slowly, not sure what I could say or do. Ethan, this is complicated. I don't know how to process what you're telling me, I said softly. But I need you to know that I'm here for you. I'm not going anywhere. He nodded, but the doubt in his eyes told me that my words weren't enough. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice breaking. I didn't want to hurt you. I just needed to tell you. My chest tightened, and I felt a lump form in my throat. It's okay to feel confused, I said, reaching out and placing a hand on his shoulder. We'll figure this out, together. But as I stood there with him, feeling the weight of his confession settle between us, a part of me knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The silence stretched, heavy and unspoken. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the clearing in shadows, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something we could never turn back from. We didn't say much on the drive back home. The silence between us was different now, though thicker, more laden with everything that had just unfolded. I wasn't sure what to do with all the new feelings swirling inside me, and I couldn't tell if Ethan was any clearer about his own emotions. His gaze was distant, focused on the passing road, but there was a restlessness about him now, a tension I hadn't noticed before. As we pulled into the driveway, I felt the weight of the world pressing down on my shoulders. The house, once a place of refuge, now felt foreign to me. I could almost feel the air shift as we parked, like even the walls could sense that everything had changed. Ethan was quiet as we walked inside, his steps heavy, like he was carrying a burden he couldn't put down. I tried to offer him a reassuring smile, but it felt hollow. He nodded in return, but didn't meet my eyes. Instead, he turned quickly and headed for the stairs, disappearing down the hall. I lingered in the living room for a moment, the silence wrapping around me like a thick fog. The house was so still. No sounds, no life. Just the muffled ticking of the clock on the wall, counting down the seconds to something I wasn't sure I was ready for. Later that evening, we found ourselves sitting together in the living room. Mary had gone to visit her sister for the weekend, and it was just the two of us again. I knew we needed to talk more, but I wasn't sure how to start. What could I say to make sense of what had just happened? How could I explain the weight of the past few hours? Ethan sat across from me, his eyes focused on the television, but I knew he wasn't really watching it. His mind was far away, lost in thought, probably wrestling with the same storm I was. I didn't want to push him. He was struggling, and I didn't want to make things worse. But I couldn't stay silent either. Finally, I broke the stillness. Ethan, my voice felt small in the quiet room. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about us. His body stiffened slightly at the mention of it. I could tell he was holding his breath, waiting for what I would say next. I don't know how to make sense of any of this, I continued, my hands fidgeting in my lap. But I want you to know that I care about you, more than anything. But I need time. I need time to understand this, to process it. Ethan looked up at me then, his eyes wide, searching mine. For a moment, the air between us was thick, as though we were both waiting for the other to make the first move. He nodded slowly, his face pale. I get it, he whispered, his voice breaking with something I couldn't quite place. I didn't know who else to talk to. I don't know what to do. I moved closer, sitting beside him. The space between us felt like an ocean, vast and impossible to cross. I placed a hand on his knee, offering him the only comfort I could. You're not alone in this, I said softly. We'll figure this out, but we need to take it slow, one step at a time. He nodded again, but I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear that had been there ever since he confessed his feelings. And yet, there was something else too. A vulnerability, a need for something that neither of us knew how to fulfill. The silence in the room deepened, and then, without warning, Ethan's face was so close to mine that I could feel his breath on my skin. It was like we were both caught in some unspoken pull, a magnetic force that neither of us could resist. And then, it happened. Our lips met, tentative at first, a brush of warmth and uncertainty. It felt like the world stopped for a moment, like everything in the universe held its breath. There was no planning, no decision. It was just inevitable. The kiss deepened, and for a brief, dizzying moment, I forgot everything. The confusion, the guilt, the shock, it all melted away, leaving only the raw, unspoken need that had been building between us. His hands found their way to my shoulders, pulling me closer as though he was afraid that if he let go, I would disappear. But then, just as quickly as it had started, the world came rushing back. The sound of the front door opening echoed through the house, and we both jumped apart as though we'd been burned. My heart was racing, my chest tight, as I turned to see Mary standing in the doorway. Her coat was still half on, her purse dangling loosely from her hand, and her eyes darted between us in shock and confusion. I couldn't breathe. "What is going on here?" Mary asked, her voice trembling barely above a whisper. I stood up, my legs unsteady, my mind a blur. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. It was like my throat had closed off, like I couldn't form a coherent thought. Ethan, however, was the first to speak. "It's my fault," he said quickly, his voice breaking. "I told him. No," I interrupted, stepping toward Mary, my hands raised in a gesture of peace. "It's not what you think. This is complicated. We didn't mean for this to happen." Mary's gaze shifted to Ethan, her face contorting with disbelief. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice rising in shock. "You told him how you feel?" I love him," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. "More than I should." I felt my heart stop in my chest. The words were out now, hanging between us like a storm cloud. There was no taking them back. The look on Mary's face said everything I needed to know: disbelief, anger, betrayal. Her hands trembled as she clutched her purse tighter, her eyes wide and filled with hurt. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "How could this happen under my roof?" "Mary, please," I said, my voice firm but desperate. "This isn't what it seems. We're just trying to understand what's happening. It's not his fault." But Mary wasn't listening anymore. She shook her head, tears starting to streak down her face. "I can't do this. I can't." Her voice broke, and she turned to leave, her footsteps hurried and frantic. "I can't be part of this." I tried to call after her, but she was already out the door, the sound of it slamming behind her like a thunderclap in the silence of the room. I stood there, frozen, watching the door swing closed. The weight of the moment hit me all at once. I turned to Ethan, whose face was pale and streaked with tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking again. "I didn't want to hurt anyone." I walked over to him, putting a hand on his shoulder. "It's not your fault. This is all complicated, but we'll figure it out together." His eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of hope and despair. "Do you mean that?" "I do," I said softly. "But we need to take this one step at a time." We stood there for a long time in the dim light of the living room, the weight of our unspoken words and the storm we'd just unleashed hanging in the air between us.